Okay, welcome back, everybody. It's time for Congress Part 3. And please note there will be no associated assignment this time for this, so it's just the lecture this time, lecture and notes. So let's start with, we talked about the president and Congress and their interactions. That was the very last slide of the last one. And so now we're going to talk about other influences on Congress that influence how they vote. One of the major influences is the political party that they belong to. And remember, even with this, party loyalty is much more important in the House than it is in the Senate. But it's still not that it's not important in the Senate, but it's more important in the House. One of the things has to do with leadership elections. So how do they influence? It's with their leadership. Also, we need to understand, and this is again, it's going to be about influence. Where in our society and in our issues are the disagreements between the parties the sharpest? Okay, if you were in class, we'd be asking, see if we can get some ideas from the students themselves. But the idea here is the biggest differences we have, they're the same in Congress as they are in society. Social welfare and economic policies. That's the major areas of sharp disagreement between the Republicans and the Democrats. In addition, parties are sources of money. These are very important for elections. We're talking about money for campaigns. And we'll talk a lot more about this when we do campaign finance. It'll be next semester. But just to give you a kind of an introduction, there are these things called congressional campaign committees that fundraise and then distribute the funds to candidates, whether they're House candidates or Senate candidates, depending on the committee, to either help them get reelected if they're their party, or help them maybe overturn a seat and turn a seat red or blue that's not that at the moment. That's an alphabet soup of committee names. It's called the DCCC, the RCCC, the DSCC, the NRSC. First two are Democrat or Republican congressional campaign committees. So those are the House side. Then the Senate side, Democrat Senate Campaign Committee, and the National Republican Senatorial Committee. And they do. And if you've seen some ads, and the ads are everywhere these days, right? Political ads. You might have seen, give you an idea, Jon Ossoff running against David Perdue for Purdue's Senate seat. Some of his ads that, especially the ones that are critical, the ones that criticize Perdue, a lot of them have been produced by, it's called the Senate Leadership Fund, and you can see that. They have to add that. They say that at the end, right? Senate Leadership Fund is responsible for this. That's the fund that comes out of the Democrat Senatorial Campaign Committee. On the other side, I can remember for District 6, next door to us, Lucy McBath, Democrat, is the sitting representative. Of course, she's running for re-election. And I can remember specifically one commercial. It does say the DCCC is responsible for the content of this ad. And we'll talk about why those things are there when we talk about campaign finance. But anyway, so this just gives you the idea why they are influential. One of the ways a party is influential. And again, so they provide that money for for election campaigns, which is very important. Because you just can't really campaign without money. I mean, it just is what it is. Another idea about Congress, we just stick this in, but it's a congressional influence. This is not party, it's just congressional influence. It is a term that you need to know called log rolling. Okay, what log rolling is basically trading votes to gain support for a bill. You vote for my bill, and I'll vote for your bill. It is a common way that things work for general regular business, the stuff we really don't hear a lot about. It's not for the big things or anything like that, but it's the stuff of their general everyday order of business. So you just need to be familiar with that term and what it means. Okay, other influences. This is one we haven't talked about yet. We talked about party, we talked about log rolling, we talked about the president. What about us? We're the ones who put them there, right? Aren't they supposed to represent us? Aren't they supposed to be influenced by us? Well, we are one. So that's the constituency. But we need to talk about some of the ways that they work, and there's going to be some terms we need to understand here. The beginning idea is, hey, they are supposed to represent our interests, but sometimes they don't. So we have to kind of understand why that happens. And in reality, it's really more of a balance, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I'm going to pause this for a second. Okay, so we're back. So again, in reality, it's more of a balance. And there's three terms you need to know, and they're all going to be bolded here. Sometimes legislators act as trustees, so we have to understand what that means. They're using their best judgment to make policy, not necessarily what their constituents may want. They're there as, okay, we elected them to use their best judgment. We trust them to do what they think is best. That's sort of the idea here. Other times, the next term, they act as instructed delegates. This is the idea that they really do mirror their constituents, certainly the majority of their constituents. So they act this way. We expect them, and they expect to represent us directly. So these are two ways, but in reality, of course, none of those are the way they act all the time. They act as trustees sometimes, they act as instructed delegates sometimes. So there's another term for that. These are all political science terms that actually act as what we call politicos. And that is that they use a balance of those two roles. Now, on the next slide, we're going to talk about when can they ignore their constituents and when can they not. And that's what we'll deal with here on the next slide. So this is the idea. You got to know those three terms. Okay, so when can they ignore it? When can they act as that trustee? When can they ignore their constituents? And here's the idea. They can ignore us, or they can act as a trustee if we don't know about the bills. There's lots and lots of obscure bills. We only know about the big major ones. Defense and foreign policy is something that is less rigid than, say, domestic policy, which is where there's sharp disagreement, and they're expected to act like instructed delegates there. The defense and foreign policy differences are sharp, so the areas where the difference in ideology is sharp, but the constituent knowledge is weak. Okay, there are lots of those areas. Now, when constituent knowledge is strong, they will have to, or they will perhaps suffer the consequences of not acting as their constituents want. So there is that. So they are careful to understand when they can and when they can't. There's another influence, though, and one of those things is what we call single issue groups. We talked about single issue voters in Unit 1 this little bit. So we're talking about single issue groups. They are beginning to have more influence, and this is on either side of these issues. There's single issue groups on both sides of the abortion debate, on both sides of the gun control debate, environmental, and a variety of other things. They are starting to have a little bit more influence as well. All right, continuing on. We have to understand who has more power here. And so we're going to go through this real quick. The House, let's talk about the House. Article 1, Section 7 gives the House one of their strongest powers, is that idea that in the Ways and Means Committee, remember that? You have to know the Ways and Means Committee is House only, and it's the place where revenue bills generate, and they can only generate there. The Senate, however, looks a little different. In the Senate, we've got areas in Article 2, it's the executive one, Section 2, Clause 2. The Senate is the only body that ratifies treaties. House has nothing to do with it. It does take a 2/3 vote there, as you can see. And again, the Senate is the one who approves ambassadors, approves cabinet secretaries, approves judges, Supreme Court justices, and all the other officers. And that just takes a majority vote. And remember, again, this is just the Senate. The House has nothing to do with it. So in the end, what we can say is, in domestic policy, it might be sort of even. Maybe the Senate has a small advantage. That's what it says after my picture. Small advantage for the Senate. However, you got to know this. In foreign policy, the Senate is absolutely dominant. By far, the Senate has more power in foreign policy for those reasons. Treaties are foreign policy. Ambassadors are foreign policy. Several of the cabinet secretaries are foreign policy. Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, those kind of things. Military officers are part of this, and other things. They are supremely powerful compared to the House as far as foreign policy goes, and you got to know that, and you got to know why. Okay, let's talk about congressional elections real quick. There are 435 districts, approximately 740 to 750,000 per district if you average it out exactly. Reapportionment, or the spreading out, or the redrawing of districts, happens every 10 years with the census. Some states might lose some districts, states will gain districts based on where people are moving. And it's generally from the northern part of the country to the southern part of the country. In most states, the legislature does the redistricting that comes with that. It can be very, very politically contentious. Some states like California use a supposed special panel that's nonpartisan. But if you look at the makeup of the panel in California, they're all Democrats anyway, because Democrats run the state. So it's not really nonpartisan there. It's kind of a ruse. But parties do want as much advantage as possible, and they draw these lines for their advantage. It's one of those things that comes with political power. It's political hardball. It is a consequence of elections, all of those things. It is politics, and it is hardball politics. Really quick, we're just going to mention this. We're going to actually talk about it in the judiciary portion after the quiz here, after this quiz coming up. So can the judiciary tell states when and how they must create their own legislative districts? So just a mention of Baker versus Carr will not be on this quiz. We're just going to refer back to it again later on. Another influence, we're still dealing with influences on Congress. Lobbyists. There are thousands and thousands of lobbyists, and we're going to talk more about them when we talk about interest groups next semester, but just to kind of get the basics. Any group that wants to influence Congress hires lobbyists, and the larger the group, the more lobbyists they have. AARP, the largest interest group in the country, they have a lot of lobbyists that try to work with Congress on issues for, say, the elder Americans. That's what AARP does, right? American Association of Retired Persons. Lobbyists have a bad image. It's kind of said the same way we say taxes. Lobbyists, taxes. We have to remember, lobbyists are people, and they represent people. But there have been, and there's a reason that they have a bad image sometimes. There have been scandals. Usually those scandals involve bribery. Like, here, I'm going to give you this much money for you to vote for this. It's totally different, and this is where we have little fine lines. How do we tell the difference between bribery and lobbying? Because what they'll do is say, we'd like you to do this, and we'll put some campaign money towards your way. That is not bribery. Bribery is giving money, but there's a really fine line between that, and a lot of people think that, they're just bribing them to vote, but it's not the case. Congress does regulate. The scandals have been few and far between these days because Congress does regulate. Lobbyists must register, they have to supply information about their activities and all of that. They are very closely regulated by Congress. Last subject, reform of Congress. We're going to get through this quickly. The idea that Congress is unrepresentative, there is that idea out there, and it is in some ways. It is the elite. There's no doubt about it. Members of Congress are what we would say are the elite of society. They choose their leaders themselves. We don't have a voice. We have no say in how they choose their own leadership, which is an influence on them. But in other ways, it is representative. We do affect the party in power. The Congress or the Senate can flip. The House can flip. And that's because of voters. So we do have a representative role. And those linkage institutions we talked about last unit, they work. They really do work. Are there obstacles to better representation? Yes. Number one, it's hard to know what constituents want. Polling is expensive, and they don't poll. You're not going to get our guy, Rob Woodall, for District 7. He's not going to poll District 7 to see how things are. It's just too expensive, it's unwieldy, and there's just no time. So it's hard to know what constituents want. Casework can take a lot of time and effort. The work that they do on behalf of constituents can take away representation issues. Are they representative? The critics say it's too uncoordinated and too fragmented. Interest groups have too much control. Some people say they're too representative. They can't take decisive action. They work at opposite goals. And an example I always use, the agriculture part of Congress helps tobacco growers, but the health-related parts of Congress try to reduce smoking. That doesn't make any sense. Excuse me, but that's the way it is. So it's hard. All of those things represent, if you remember those political science theories, this would be hyperpluralism. The critics would say that this is a hyperpluralistic problem. They say they protected too many interests of the people. Last thing, there's defenders. Decentralization has eliminated all powerful leadership. Major reforms have happened, and they do happen. But then the last thing, this is all rhetorical. Is there a solution? Probably not. Can it please everyone? Absolutely not. So maybe they can make some changes, and they have made some changes, but it is still going to never, ever satisfy everyone. Okay, we're just up against the time limit. That's the last of this part. One more lecture and then a quiz on Congress. So I'll see you on the other side. Have a great day.